Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review from Gran Turismo Sport, and this time it's another car that wasn't added in an update, but it was still new to the series. But it was in Gran Turismo Sport, of course, from day one, and that is the Mercedes A45 AMG. Now the funny thing about this review is I thought, and if you'd have asked me, I'd have said I've already done this, because it just seems like one of those cars that you could easily talk about and then forget. Not that it's a bad car, but it's just one of those more normal street-level vehicles that arrives in the game from launch that you can easily be infatuated with initially because it's the fresh new thing, but then not necessarily use it all that much. And I'm going to get into more of the reason why, of course, as we go through the review, because there are some good points about the car, definitely some drawbacks as well, but one of the unique things actually about this review is it's one of only, I think, 2 cars currently in GT Sport that I actually have real-world experience with, because I hired a brand new, in fact technically newer than this, a 2019 Mercedes A-Class to go to Goodwood in. I hired it for the whole weekend, did about 500 miles in it overall, and I absolutely loved it. And of course we'll get to the other car that I've driven at some point in the future, which also happens to be a hatchback as well. But of course the car that I hired was not an A45 AMG. It was a lower level model, but at the same time it was interesting because it gave me this new perspective on a car that we drive in the game. Because although the car that I hired didn't have the power or the performance or the AMG badge, what it did have is the same kind of interior look, and also of course the same proportions in terms of its cornering ability. And again, it wasn't the same by any stretch, but it's interesting because it gives me a different perspective when I then go into the game and drive the car. So with that in mind, what are my thoughts on the A45? Because it's not a car that you really see people use all that often anymore. There are certainly better options out there, but at the same time, does it have redeeming features? Because I would say straight off the bat that one of the biggest downsides of something like a Mercedes hot hatch, not in terms of just what this one can do, but even just as a concept, is that Mercedes models are always far more expensive in Gran Turismo than their counterparts are. If you look at the race cars, the Sauber C9 was the most expensive prototype in Gran Turismo 6. If you look at the Mercedes coupes like the CLK, the SL convertible, various others, they're always very expensive. Now, why would that be a problem here? Well, the reason why, put simply, is because it's a hot hatch, and regardless of what level of hot hatch it is, 64,000 credits in the game is a lot of money for a hot hatchback. And although of course there are others which are expensive as well, like the Clio V6 for instance, it's a hefty amount of money, especially if you're early on in the game. Now in Gran Turismo Sport you can win a ton of cars. I believe I've won numerous Mercedes A45s in the daily spins, and even as far as money goes, you can earn 64 grand easily, of course, so that's not the point. I'm talking more about the principle of it. A hot hatch that's 64 grand just kind of annoys me, because regardless of the brand behind it, that's just a whole lot of money for a hot hatch. Now as far as what it offers, it's an interesting package because you've got a 2-litre turbo-aspirated engine, it's all-wheel drive. Of course the visuals were a complete overhaul compared to the original A-Class, and I think, and hence the thumbnail, it was a much needed redesign, and in fact a reimagination, if you will, of the entire vehicle as a concept, because the original A-Class, it kind of made sense at the time. It was a very small Mercedes, Audi was also doing their weird little A2 at the time, but this one is a proper hot hatch, a proper hatchback to go up against the best of the best, like the Ford Focus, the best sellers in that category. Now as far as the performance goes, it certainly isn't lacking, and being a later model, current generation hot hatch if you will, or close to it, of course you're going to be looking at over 300 horsepower at this point. In fact this one has 355. That's a lot for a hot hatch, even by hot hatch standards. That's in the higher tiers of them, which again, it's an AMG, so no surprises there. And speaking of that AMG tie-in, it has what a lot of hatchbacks do not have, and that is a whole lot of torque. And again, this is one of the few things that the car that I drove actually did have as well, because it was a very torquey motor, and it was a lot of fun because of that. It was very effortless performance. I loved having the kind of flappy paddle integration in there as well, which of course a ton of cars have now. Even a decade ago that was much more rare to see on hot hatches, and 2 decades ago, like the early to mid 2000s, it was next to unheard of. Now of course all of that's all well and good, but the main disadvantage of this car is the weight. It is very heavy for a hatchback, regardless of if it was an original A-Class or this bigger model, regardless of the all-wheel drive, whatever. 1,555 kilos is very hefty for a hatchback. Now, again, it's a Mercedes, so you've got the all-wheel drive, it's packed full of tech, it's a modern hatchback anyway, so of course the safety, the soundproofing, the technology, all this kind of stuff adds weight more often than not, so it's not surprising that it's hefty, but even so, by hatchback standards, that's quite a lot. That's up there with even some Lambos in terms of weight. Now, the horsepower per tonne does suffer because of that, even though it does pack a good healthy punch when it comes to torque and power, but you can feel it through the corners. And it actually feels similar to something like the Mitsubishi GTO in that way, where it's got great straight line performance for a hot hatch, but through the corners, it's surprisingly sluggish. With that being said though, the curious thing about this car is that I would not say that it has bad handling. Both the one that I drove in real life and this one in the game have great handling. In fact, way better than the original A-Class had, that's for sure. And in fact, I would say it's one of the better handling hatchbacks in the game because of the fact that it has all-wheel drive, so torque steer is nowhere near as much of an issue. Even understeer in general is, I would say, easier to combat when you've got all four wheels rather than just the fronts giving you power to the road. So it's not that it has bad handling, it's just, well, as I said, like the Mitsubishi, that's not a bad handling car either. You can just definitely feel the weight. And that brings me to what I referenced early on in the video that I think is the biggest nail in the coffin for this car not being used a lot more by a lot more people. And that is the category. Because stock, this car is already N300. That is a lot. Now, having a lot of power in a hatchback is all well and good, and in Gran Turismo 6, for instance, if, of course, you could have had this car in there, which isn't technically possible, but imagine that it was, and this car was subject to, instead of the N-Class system, it would be subject, of course, to the PP points system instead. I think this car would have done a lot better then, because it would have been more accurate, because that weight would have been taken into account, and that's the biggest single drawback of the N-Classes in Gran Turismo Sport, and that is that they do not factor in weight. It's purely based on power, and that simply doesn't work, because that kind of methodology and logic ends up with a Jay Leno tank car being in the same category as a Koenigsegg, and that makes zero sense. So, this car is literally toe-to-toe with Porsche 911 GT3s straight off the bat. That's with no tuning, and unfortunately, even if you detune it, you can still feel the disadvantage. There are so many cars that can be detuned to be an equal level to this one that it just feels like it doesn't bring anything significant enough to the table to be better than everything else. And it pains me to say that because Mercedes AMGs are actually some of my favourite cars in their respective categories. They make great SUVs, great super saloons, a lot of great iconic sports cars and even supercars, but when it comes to the hot hatch category, I really would say that this is one of those cars which, in a similar way to others that I've mentioned, such as Tesla, for instance, the best things about the car cannot be experienced in a game. And that, on this occasion, is coming from someone who has driven one in real life. And it's so much better in real life, even without being the AMG model, than it feels in the game. Because the best things about this car are next to irrelevant in the game. The interior is gorgeous on this car. The way it handles is fantastic. The way it feels in the city, on the highway, the handling on B roads, hence the name of the series, B-Road Ballers, across the board. I loved it. I was impressed with it. In fact, I was surprised by it because of Gran Turismo. Because of course there are plenty of cars that have things that you cannot feature in the game, but there are some that definitely hinge more on those things than others. This thing with 355 horsepower out in the real world on the street would feel fantastic, especially with all-wheel drive. The proportions are perfect. It's got a moderate sized nose with a very short stumpy back end as far as hatchbacks go, which feels perfectly proportioned. It's lower and wider, of course, than the original A-Class was, so there's no worry of the elk test going wrong this time around. But in the game, most of that doesn't mean much. The proportions don't really matter, the handling only matters to a certain degree when it's as heavy as it is. In real life, nobody cares how heavy their car is on a daily basis, and most people never take their car to a track day, so it doesn't matter. In the game though, it means a lot. So for me, it really does highlight one of those occasions where I would love to give different thoughts on the car because of having experienced it in real life, because in real life, it'll put a smile on your face, I guarantee that. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.